Kia ora Internet.
Hello and welcome.
I'm James,
I'm Claire
and welcome to our latest podcast.
of the... I thought you were going to say episode, and I was going to say the Sky Bear Games podcast.
Well, it is the Sky Bear Games podcast.
Yes.
And following up from our podcast that we did on Ravenloft, we are doing another classic Dungeons & Dragons campaign setting this week.
That's bunnies you can hear in the background, by the way. I'm sorry. We have to record upstairs so we can hear our baby cry out if he cries
You
out.
may also wind up hearing the neighbours' dogs, who
Yeah.
have been barking for the last little while. This week, we're going to be talking about the biggest of the Dungeons & Dragons campaign settings, and actually the oldest of the Dungeons & Dragons campaign settings, The Forgotten Realms.
Wow.
And they've never actually been my favourite, and yet, like a lot of people, I think a lot of people wind up looking down on The Forgotten Realms.
It's not your favourite.
Yeah, so The Forgotten Realms is not my favourite campaign setting, and I think a lot of people look down on it for being the generic setting, the baseline setting. And that's why we've decided to talk about it this time, because I was talking to some of my friends who were planning a Dungeons & Dragons game of their own, and they said they were going to set it in the generic world, The Forgotten Realms. And I thought that's kind of sad. The Forgotten Realms isn't necessarily the generic world, and it does have its own flavour, which often gets lost.
Yeah, I feel like Wizards, especially in 5th edition, treats it like the kitchen sink world.
I think The Forgotten Realms suffers from two poles, both of which are damaging to it. One of them is that it's the generic world. It's the world that has no specific flavour of its own.
It has everything and the kitchen sink.
Yes. And on the other hand, for people who actually go looking at the lore, The Forgotten Realms is possibly the most developed fantasy world, sci-fi world, geek world of all time. There's almost 300 novels. There's, I don't even know how many hundreds of gaming books. There's all the computer games. When it comes to role-playing worlds, I can't think of another world that has had as much written about it as The Forgotten Realms. The only things that could rival it are franchises like Star Wars or Star Trek, really.
Wow. Right.
So, where should we start with our talk about The Forgotten Realms?
Well, let's go way back to the beginning. Let's talk about Ed Greenwood and where it all began.
So, The Forgotten Realms started in 1967.
Wow, I didn't even know.
The Forgotten Realms is older than Dungeons & Dragons is.
Right.
He made it, just like how Greg Stafford made Glorantha to be his world, where he could tell stories and later it became a role-playing world. The Forgotten Realms was a place where Ed Greenwood, as a tender youth of 8 or whatever it was, could write his terrible fantasy pastiche stories.
Right.
Everyone's fantasy pastiche stories that they write when they're 8 are terrible. It's the rules.
Absolutely.
But it became fleshed out over time, and then when he discovered Dungeons & Dragons, he adapted it, and he set it in his world. Then from there, it showed up in Dragon magazine, starting in 1979. So he would start submitting articles, and they were meant to be generic articles, just, here is the backstory of a monster, here is a new spell. But with all of them, he had his character that he used to talk about his stuff, Alminster.
Yep.
And he would put in all these details about cities and countries and battles and characters and so on. And so these articles really stood out. After TSR had published Dragonlance, they were looking for a new campaign setting, and someone said, hey, what about that guy who writes for Dragon magazine? He seems to have a lot of stuff that's really well thought out. Someone should talk to him. So they rang him up and they said, are you just making the stuff up as you go along, or do you actually have notes on all of the stuff? And he said, yes and yes. And so he sold The Forgotten Realms to TSR for a fairly minimal fee.
Oh boy.
Token fee, and delivered some ludicrous amount of notes that he had prepared on the world.
Yeah.
And delivered it to their offices, and they started hammering it out into a campaign setting for publication. And that right there is sort of the start of where the Forgotten Realms started losing its flavour.
Oh.
Because right from the beginning, it started getting changed from his original vision.
Yeah. That's why I looked so worried for.
Yes, it's that it can be really hard to keep your creative control when you're doing this sort of a project, which other creators apart from him discovered.
Yeah.
Any sort of shared world, you have to wind up compromising and working with other people. And I think Ed Greenwood actually liked working with other people in his world, and he liked having things get hammered in. So a whole lot of generic D&D books got retconned into the Forgotten Realms.
Oh, that's why I sort of. That explains my surprise at you saying that Dragonlance came first.
Yeah,
First thing.
what they felt was Dragonlance was all about this one massive story, whereas the Forgotten Realms was meant to be a world where you could set any story.
Yeah.
It was so big and there was so much space in it. Yeah, so he and Jeff Grubb worked together on it, and they made the campaign setting and they released heaps of books. And I'm pretty sure that part of the contract for selling the Forgotten Realms was that Ed Greenwood got to keep writing for it. They had to keep publishing books under that he'd worked on or material that he'd worked on. And so that was a way in which he sort of managed to keep creative control, kind of.
Yeah.
Though even then, I know he got to write one of the original novels, and it's terrible.
Yeah.
It's absolutely terrible. It is an appalling novel. A lot of Ed Greenwood's novels don't read them. He's great at ideas, but his execution tends to involve
ladies and clothes falling off.
Ladies and clothes falling off.
Yeah.
Yeah. And dirty old wizards.
You're basically calling out half of the old male fantasy writers right now.
I am. But he says that actually the book, as it got published, was not at all what he wanted to do, and it was a very different book, and he got forced by the editors to include some of the ridiculous stuff that he didn't want to put in. And he wanted to tell a story more about how this small adventuring party got together and then they completely messed up their first adventure and half of them died. And TSR said, no, you have to turn it into a power fantasy and you've got to include all of these monsters and fight scenes and also it's got to be shorter and what have you.
Right.
But anyway, yeah, these disputes sort of started from the beginning and this sort of corporate editing, and that got to points where, for example, for 4th edition, where they decided to basically blow up the world and start again from scratch and sort of clear the slate, he was really upset about that and wound up plotting with one of the other writers to reverse the whole thing later on.
Right. Wait, so is that why 4th edition was in a different world?
No, 4th edition was in the Forgotten Realms.
Oh, was it? I thought it was
Oh, no, I see what you mean. Yes. No, what they did was they had their own sort of homebrew world, and then they did one campaign setting a year. And the first one they did was the Forgotten Realms.
Okay.
Where they took a lot of the complaints that people have with it, like how there's so many high-level characters running around, and they wiped them all out.
Do you want to say that thing that you said to me now, or
so
it was a really cool little factoid.
Yeah, I thought this was cool. So apparently, in Ed Greenwood's idea, one of the problems people have with the Forgotten Realms is that there's so many high-level characters.
We should go into them,
and
eventually
we should. Elminster, for example, is a god-level wizard. He's I think the last time he got statted up, he was something like level 36 or something.
Right.
Obscene.
Laeral, Silverhand.
Yeah, Laeral, Ilastriel, all the Seven Sisters, Manchun for the Zentarum. There's all these super powerful wizards. And so the argument is, why do any player characters do anything when there's these ridiculously high-level wizards who could just come in, snap their fingers, and solve any problem?
Yeah, how does it not turn into NPC theatre all the time?
Yeah, which is a lot of people struggle with. And apparently in Ed Greenwood's own campaign, the way he handled it was that wizards, when they get to a certain point, are basically like nuclear weapons. That, yes, Elminster could go and deal with this problem, but then if he moves, then one of the other super powerful wizards would move, and sure, maybe he would wind up winning. Probably he'd wind up winning the battle that would follow, but the devastation would wipe out entire countries from 2 level 30 archmages going at it.
What I love about this is it's basically like a fantasy version of the Cold War, but visually Dragon Ball Z, where like they're powering up and just boom, like the humongous shockwave of their powers. Yeah.
Yeah, they'd be casting so many wishes and meteor swarms and
Yeah.
summoning dragons to fight for them.
Oh my goodness.
That none of them actually want to do that.
No. Yeah.
And so everybody gets low-level characters to go and do their missions for them.
It's plausible deniability.
I thought that was a really cool concept when I read that. And
it's made the whole setting make a lot more sense for me.
But the other
you've said
things with the Forgotten Realms, the reason why I've appreciated it more over time, is a lot of the stuff that we take for granted in a role-playing world comes from the Forgotten Realms originally.
Right, like what?
Like the maps with the trade routes.
Okay.
Like the details about day-to-day life.
Yeah.
Like the focus on the politics and the interconnections between factions.
Wait. So you're telling me all the stuff that I like about D&D comes from Ed Greenwood, comes from Forgotten Realms?
A lot of it, yeah.
Because I know, like, from what I've heard about the way that Gary Gygax played D&D, I personally would not be very interested in sitting down at his table.
No. You read his adventures and their dungeon crawls you're not expected to associate with who your character is.
If you die, you're supposed to just
you just start
roll
up a new
and,
character. Yeah. It's just a game.
Yeah.
It was very he'd just throw things in as he saw fit. You know, we say that Ed Greenwood has this kitchen sink setting, but Gary Gygax had a god of cowboys because one of his players liked cowboys, and so he just said, "Sure, you can be a cowboy. Here are your holy 6 shooters. Off you go."
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, so all the stuff of actually role playing, actually like imagining the life of a city and the life of the people in it.
And so Ed Greenwood said what he'd like to do is he'd pick one very small town and he would come up with who are the people in it, what are the different power factions on a very sort of street level.
Right.
You know, the merchants who are powerful, the political influencers, what's actually going on in a day-to-day thing. And he'd put a few clues around about things that the players could get involved with, and he'd have, here are some clues that lead you to interesting things on the outside of the map, and then he'd just let them go.
Right.
And so that's that sort of sandbox
awesome.
idea.
Yeah.
So there'd be a dungeon, which you could go and explore that, or you could sign up for one of about 3 or 4 different factions, or you could go do something else if you wanted. And when the PCs moved in a direction, he'd just expand the map around them. Which apparently is why there are so many Arabian Nights-themed places scattered around the Forgotten Realms, because he'd always put them on the edges of his maps, and then over time they're sort of multiplied. Classic. Which I think is kind of cool, actually.
Yeah.
But also, with a lot of the old Dungeons & Dragons art, you'll see a lot of the really old stuff being that sort of unrealistic, cheesecakey, men with muscles everywhere.
Conan type
things, right? And armor that's not very practical.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the Forgotten Realms, everybody dresses like they're kind of a Robin Hood Renaissance fair pastiche.
Yeah.
And it's this huge step towards what is it actually like to be in this world.
Definitely. Like, you can definitely still see the edges, like, especially now.
Oh, absolutely.
The plethora of options we've got now for role-playing.
And there are other worlds now which are far more cohesive,
immersive and fleshed out.
But the Forgotten Realms was kind of this really early example that went really widestream. I don't know when that happened comparatively to some of the other big early settings like Glorantha. I know Glorantha as we see it now is much more fleshed out than it was back in the day, whereas I get the feeling the Forgotten Realms was always that detailed.
Yeah, and in fact, if anything, because of how it's just sort of been treated like this generic template world,
I feel a lot of those details that Ed Greenwood came up with got shaved off.
Yeah,
I know, for example, he had a lot more moral complexity and ambiguity in his games that TSR had shaved off, and so factors like the Zentarum, who wound up just being cartoonishly evil, were a little bit more nuanced. There was a little bit more sort of real politic going on with them.
Well, that's interesting.
Some of the other factions. The Harpers originally were not necessarily a force for good.
Oh.
They were a force for balance, which he saw as being much more important in his world. A good ruler, a ruler with good intentions, might do something that would have these negative flow-on effects. And so the Harpers might well be opposed to them as well, because they were trying to keep everything balanced.
Oh, okay.
But yes, a lot of this got sort of taken out over time, and a lot of the more distinctive Forgotten Realms flavor either became mainstream or the sort of more generic ideas replaced it over time.
Yeah, and I find that interesting as someone who came in at 4th edition, and also for a lot of new people who've come in at 5th edition, they might not know it. They might not appreciate how actually Forgotten Realms was the genesis of a lot of the things we actually like about D&D.